only needs to be removed from that project, but it needs to pass all the way through the system. And a complicating factor during the flood event here in Nashville area was at the same time there was also a flood crest moving down the Ohio River. So we couldn't necessarily just dump a lot more water down to the lower Ohio. Those operations were coordinated as well. So you've got to have enough time to get that water out of the system.
If you had, I mean, hindsight's 20/20 obviously, and if we could go back in time, could you have made that much of a difference by, you know, dropping the water levels days in advance of the storm?
That's a really good question, and that is something we've looked at. It's not a one-to-one relationship. In other words, we lowered Cheatham 1 foot. Well, what if you had lowered 3 feet? Would the crest have dropped 2 feet? The answer is no. It would have perhaps been on the order of inches of difference in the ultimate flood crest, and that would have been gained by lowering, say, Cordell Hull and/or Old Hickory pools to be able to hold back a little more water up there. Any lowering we would have done on the river here in Nashville would have been quickly overwhelmed during the unprecedented floods.
So in other words, I guess from what I'm getting from you is it wouldn't have made that much of a difference if you had done what people are asking you to have done.
Yeah, the difference I would categorize as insignificant.
I would caveat that by saying you can make a difference on the margins at certain locations. So for example, thanks to intense coordination with the city, we were able to both manage some minor water level increases and provide sandbags that saved the Almahundra water plant. That was a huge difference for the city because we did have safe drinking water because that plant was safe. But we were within inches after the sandbags were placed of that being overtopped, as I recall. So you can make a difference at the margins at specific locations, but in terms of the overall scheme, it's not a big difference.
General Peabody, I wanted to ask you,
Yes,
if I could, about the communication issue.
Sure.
You've been very frank about the communication could have been better. But what I'd like to ask you is the impact on the regular people that live on the river. If the information had gotten to the National Weather Service and gotten better flood forecasts, how would that have impacted these people? Could people have gotten out earlier? Would it have made a difference in people's lives if they'd had better communication?
I don't think we can ever know the answer to that question because it didn't happen. This is a dynamic between the two agencies that work together. You know, the weather forecasts, the Weather Service relies on their own forecasts, on their own gauges of precipitation that's coming down, and their flow meters at various points in the system. They also rely on us primarily to provide information related to the water that's passing through the system. In the past, we had assumed that they would assume that once we got to full storage conditions, that they would assume that full flow was going through, and in fact that was not their understanding. So there was a misunderstanding between our two agencies that was part of the problem. The other issue here is this is an issue that the Weather Service really needs to answer, because in the event they are responsible for, because they're primarily responsible for the precipitation inputs, which are the key aspect of the equation, they're responsible to make the forecast. Whoever was that, I probably did something wrong to the core. I don't know. Thanks. They're responsible to.
Trust us, we do much worse than those.
To conclude, they're responsible to make the forecast, but they can't do so accurately without our inputs on our flow on our projects. And because this was such a dynamically, continually changing situation, none of us had faced this before, and they just didn't get the inputs from us that they needed.
Are your water experts telling you that the amount of water that was released through the dam, do you know now if that contributed excessively to the flooding downtown, or had it all moved downstream and not have added to the amount of flooding that we saw in the Nashville area?
Yeah, the project management could not have changed. So the project management, in fact, had a net result of lowering the high crest of the river by about 5 feet. The overall impact on Nashville would have been very different, or very little different, if at all.
Okay, let's take a question from the phone. Anyone on the telephone have a question? Going once? Okay, and
Yeah, I have a question, about the projects farther upstream. Well, you said we stopped discharge from Wolf Creek and Cordell Hall, but it takes quite a while for some of that water to get down here. You're saying the project will manage properly, but is the next report will come out, will it be more in detail to show if in fact maybe the discharge wasn't stopped early enough, or, you know, it wasn't timed properly?
We're not publishing another report, at least we don't intend to.
No, I mean the final, the one that's coming out next year, the 700.
The Weather Service assessment?
Yeah,
I can't, that's their report, I can't speak to what it's gonna contain, but I don't think it's gonna address our flood risk management projects and what we
No,
store.
Just to clarify.
Oh, the post-flood report.
Yeah, the weather service.
Rich,
report.
why don't, I got it, why don't you
Yeah.
go ahead and address that?
Yeah, the post-flood report's not gonna be focused on project release information. It's gonna be focusing on this meteorological event. But I can tell you, to answer the question, and Bob may want to help me here, but in terms of holding water back earlier in our projects that are farther upstream, like Wolf Creek and Center Hill, it wouldn't have made much difference because there's not a lot of outflow occurring from those projects anyway. I mean, there's probably in the range of, for Wolf Creek, for example, 14 to 20,000 cubic feet per second, and we held it back to a couple of hundred cubic feet per second. But that kind of flow is not a great deal of input in the context of the size of this storm. We had, you know, at lower parts of the river, at Barkley, we had over 300,000 cubic feet per second that we were releasing at the peak. And then the ones right upstream in Nashville, what was the peak discharge at Old Hickory, for example?
Our peak discharge at Old Hickory was reported at just over 212,000.
It's actually listed on this chart right here.
And just to follow up a little bit on your question, of course, Wolf Creek is located well above Nashville. So much like what I described earlier, you would need to make adjustments to the main stem several days in advance. We would have done something similar at Wolf Creek. Now, coming on down closer, Dale Hollow we shut off. Actually, we shut off Wolf Creek and Dale Hollow to protect Cordell Hall, because they flowed directly into Cordell Hall, and Cordell Hall was getting into trouble on Sunday evening and on into Monday. But closer to Nashville, certainly when we shut off Center Hill, that protected Carthage and lowered the inflow to Old Hickory. And then we did some operations at Percy Priest, the most downstream storage project, to directly benefit the Nashville area.
You guys talk about making a difference in the margins. There's 20 things that have been isolated for improvement, be it from quicker adjustment levels to better communication to, you know, when we ask you specifically about one thing, what did it make a difference, and you guys say it's insignificant, if all 20 of those insignificant things had been added up together, would that aggregate have been more significant of a, I mean, in other words, a house maybe they got two feet of flooding,
Yeah,
we could only gotten one, you know, that's not made up number. But.
Let me be clear. When I say insignificant, I mean insignificant in terms of how many inches of difference you could have made in the flood, and it would have been really marginal, talking an inch or two. Again, we can't go back in time and rewind and then replay and re-record and do the event differently. So it's really impossible for us to know if we could have lowered the crest at all. It is our judgment, based on this review by a number of professionals from outside the Nashville district, that the Nashville district professionals, led by Bob Sneed, really did the best they could under the circumstances, and that in fact that they held the river to the best that they could hold it under the circumstances. Where we did not perform as we should have was communicating the information continuously, clearly, so that it was understandable to the Weather Service, so that they in turn could communicate forecasts to the people that you asked about that live in the floodplains or near the floodplains of the river. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, sir.